Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this APM webinar on how we've aligned our product fundamental qualification and product RPMQ qualification to the Body of Knowledge 7th edition. My name is Neil Pearce, and I'm a Professional Standards Manager, and I'm joined by Jill Hancock, who's the Head of Qualifications and Standards Development. And as I said, this webinar is on the theme of assessment update, and this is part of a series of webinars that are running from November to April, and they happen to be on the 13th of each month. And the next one on the 13th of January is on the theme of indicative content. You have, I believe, the function to type in questions. If you click on questions, you can please type in a question and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. There is time to do that. And indeed, I can see that Graham has been very keen and asked a question already. So thank you, Graham. We will cover that off, as I say, at the end of the webinar. So on screen now, you should be able to see the agenda. So we'll talk about the specification briefly to begin with. And yes, this is being recorded, so you will be able to play back this afterwards, this webinar afterwards. We'll make that available to you. So we'll talk about the specification a little bit to begin with, which is a recap for the benefit of anybody who didn't join the webinar last month in November. Then we'll introduce the sample papers, and then we'll talk about indicative content, and we'll use examples from the indicative content and sample papers, which was both released on the 29th of November, so I hope you've had a chance to look at both of those documents. Then we'll go on to talk about marking the PMQ scripts and really the general principles APM will be following when we train our markers to mark scripts. And lastly, we'll be talking about some PMQ exam technique really for candidates, and these are some suggested points you may wish to raise with your candidates. And as I said, the last agenda item is questions, so please do carry on typing in questions and we'll go through those at the end. So as you can see on screen, if we talk about PFQ, first of all, this is multiple choice exam. It's 60 questions in 60 minutes. We'll cover all 59 assessment criteria or ACs in the syllabus, and one AC will be covered by 2 questions, and the AC covered by 2 questions will potentially change from question paper to question paper. The PMQ, candidates have to answer 10 out of 16 questions in 3 hours. So that's right. That's exactly the same as it is at the moment for the Body of Knowledge 6th edition qualification that candidates can take today. Each question is split into 2 parts. Part A is worth 20 marks and Part B is worth 30 marks. And that split of A and B and the 20 marks and 30 marks will be the same for all PMQ questions in the Body of Knowledge 7th edition qualification. We recommend candidates spend 15 minutes per question, and that can be split down into 6 minutes for Part A and 9 minutes for Part B, and that leaves 30 minutes for reading time, and some of that reading time can be spent reading the questions at the start of the exam, or it could be used by candidates to review their answers at the end, should they choose to do so. It's worth noting both parts of the questions will target the same learning outcome, so both Part A and Part B will be from the same learning outcome in the syllabus, although they may be from quite different specific areas of the syllabus. They'll be from the same in terms of topics, but they'll be from the same learning outcome. And then for anybody doing the Prince 2 qualifications, you can see the details there on screen. So that's 6 out of 10 questions in 2 hours, which is the same as it is currently. And then the time is 15 minutes per question, 6 minutes we recommend for Part A and 9 minutes for Part B, again with 30 minutes reading time, and again both parts of the question will target the same learning outcome. So the sample papers for both PFQ and PMQ have been published, and there are a couple of intentions behind publishing these documents. They're there to help candidates to prepare. So you could choose to use them as mock exams or homework exercises, depending on how you want to structure your course. They support candidates so they can familiarise themselves with the assessments, question style and format. So it would be useful for the candidate to be able to look at the sample paper and see, for example, for PMQ, that there are always going to be a Part A and Part B, and also have a look at the PFQ style of multiple choice questions. By and large, they're the same as they are for Body of Knowledge 6th edition. So therefore, there's a straightforward multiple choice question where you've got 4 options, they have to choose one. There's the sentence complete question style, and there's the filling in the missing word in the stem. There's also some negative questions. So, for example, which of the following is not, and candidates have to choose the answer. And there's also one where candidates have to select which distractor is correct. And if you look at the PFQ sample paper, question 2 is an example of that last style of PFQ question. So it is worth looking at those sample papers. And also, as the last bullet point says, they demonstrate how command verbs are presented in the context of an actual question. So if we move on to consider indicative content, we publish indicative content which covers each AC which has a question on the sample paper. So the full indicative content covering all ACs will be published on the 10th of January, and that's a couple of days before the next webinar on the 13th of January, which, as I said, will cover the indicative content in more detail. The purpose of the indicative content from a candidate's point of view is to support learning and understanding of the syllabus, and from your point of view as training providers, to support the development of learning and training materials. So we advise you to look at indicative content as you are developing the learning and training materials. And the last line there is really important to stress. Please note that additional materials will be needed to develop, will need to be developed rather, to pass the PMQ. So APM do not want to publish all materials or examples needed to pass, as this will turn the PMQ into a sort of a memory test, i.e. can candidates learn and then reproduce all the examples in the exam time, and we don't believe this supports good teaching and learning. And it doesn't necessarily test whether candidates can demonstrate their knowledge and understanding. So you want to get away from that approach. After this slide and over the next couple of slides, we'll be looking at examples of questions for the sample paper and indicative content. So hopefully that will bring these points alive a bit more. But just for context, I just want to run through a couple of points about the indicative content. So for assessment criteria containing the command verbs explain, describe, differentiate and interpret, between 1 and 3 examples have been given within indicative content to support the interpretation of the assessment criteria. Not all elements of the assessment criteria aren't necessarily covered in the examples given. It's more just an indication of how the assessment criteria could be interpreted. And candidates will need to expand and develop on the indicative content examples in order to pass the exam, which is the point I made a minute ago. So that there's no intention on our behalf to make the indicative content document which outlines everything the candidate needs to know. The examples there are indicative examples of how to cover that particular AC, but you guys as training providers will need to provide much fuller, a lot more examples, as it says in the document itself. And just to cover off the last bullet point around state and outline, when you look at the indicative content for questions which begin with the command verb state and outline, no examples have been given. And this is done on purpose because for the questions which begin with state and outline, candidates need to provide these sort of examples or demonstrate their knowledge rather than provide a much fuller answer, for example, an explanation or description. So if we were to include examples of creditworthy content in indicative content for state and outline questions, we are giving away potential answers to future questions, which is obviously something we wish to avoid. So quite purposely for the state and outline indicative content, they're on their examples. I hope that makes sense. We're now going to look at some examples for indicative content and sample paper questions, and Jill will talk you through those.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just want to take the opportunity to talk through some examples from the sample paper and also how the indicative content can be applied to that and how that then links back to the command verbs as well. So the next part of the webinar, we're going to look at a differentiate question, a describe question, and also an explain question as we go through and how that indicative content can be applied. So if we look at part A of the question 10 that's on the screen at the moment, it's 2 phases of the project life cycle and explain how the roles of project manager and project sponsor differ during the 2 phases, which is worth 20 marks. So that's 10 marks each on those points. If we look at the indicative content for the assessment criteria, which is differentiate between the responsibilities of the project manager and the project sponsor throughout the project, there's a really key paragraph there within the indicative content that sort of talks about the examples being given below that need to be expanded on within there. But I think the important part of that is about demonstrating the differences between the responsibilities of the project manager and the project sponsor throughout the project, but also the reasons for those differences. So just by documenting what the role of each of those roles is, that's not going to get you the marks you would need for that particular question. It's about focusing on the differences and the reasons for those differences to be able to score those marks. So if we look at the command verb for differentiate, it's about recognising or determining what makes something different. So it's the what it is that makes it different and why it's different that is the key element of that command verb. So there are some examples there that are given in the indicative content around the project sponsor owning the business case, whereas the project manager is responsible for delivery of outputs. That would need to be expanded further around the reasons for those differences as well, and that would relate to the role that the individuals would potentially have within the project. Okay, moving on to the next example from the same question, we've got to select 3 of the project roles below and describe how their responsibilities throughout the project. You then have a list of 4 project roles, so the candidate has the choice of 3 of those to then choose from, and that would be 10 marks each per role. Okay, so this is very much a describe question. It relates to the assessment criteria 1.5. Describe other roles within the project management, including those that are in the list that are there. Again, pointing out the key elements that the requirement really is around providing a relevant description of the roles within project management to demonstrate knowledge and understanding. So the roles have been given to you in the question. The response we would be expecting from candidates is around a description in that particular question, we're talking about the responsibilities. So if we look at the command verb here for describe, it's about giving an account, including all the relevant characteristics, qualities, and events. So the particular question that's being asked is around the responsibilities of each of those roles, which would sort of come into that description of the characteristics. And what we would be expecting is what those roles are and what those responsibilities are within that particular within the project environment. Moving on then to an example of an explain question. If we look at part 2, you've got to explain 3 steps in a requirements management process that help to establish the scope of a project. If we go to the indicative content, it relates to 7.2, which is explain how to establish scope through requirements management processes. And again, there's a sort of key paragraph there around candidates need to be able to demonstrate a knowledge and understanding of the requirements management process, the stages that it follows, and importantly, how this helps to establish the scope of the project. So with a candidate just answering what the stages are with regards to the requirements management processes, they would score some marks, but because it's an explain question, which is where we're asking people to give an account of the purposes or the reasons, what we would really need in terms of an answer is about how that helps to establish the scope of the project. So what's really key in all of these is to look at the indicative content to see how that relates to the assessment criteria, but from the candidate perspective, it's really about reading the question and making sure that they are answering the question that's posed on the paper. So the indicative content is given to support the assessment criteria to help you and to help candidates understand the direction that we're going in with regards to the types of answers we would expect. But it's absolutely imperative that the candidate reads the question that's on the exam paper and answers the question, rather than just sort of regurgitating all the things they know about that particular area that might be based on this indicative content. In terms of marking the PMQ scripts, just some general principles that we wanted to highlight. We work on the basis of positive marking, so APM rewards marks for what is there rather than removing marks for what is not there. So we do work on a positive marking perspective. No specific marks are awarded for spelling, punctuation and grammar, but if the marker can't read or understand what is written, then they can't award the marks for it. So it's sort of up to the candidate really to write it in a clear way that can be read and understood, but they won't lose marks in terms of spelling or punctuation or grammar. That's not something we're marking on. If a candidate does not answer the 10 questions, then the unanswered ones will score a mark of 0. And the same for the PM key for Prince 2. If they don't answer the 6 questions, then again the unanswered questions will also score 0. Importantly, if a candidate answers more than 10 questions or more than 6 in PM key for Prince 2, only the first 10 or 6 will be marked. So it's important that the candidates pick out the questions they think they're going to score the highest on. Okay, so the approach that we take to marking PMQ is in line with good practice used by other awarding bodies. Marks will be standardised using scripts both prior to May 2020 and also throughout PMQ's life cycle to ensure a consistent standard is used. We are recruiting and training more markers in the new year to supplement the marker pool that we have, so obviously they'll go through the same rigorous training process that all our other markers have gone through, and through the standardisation process as well. And just one point to make with regards to the marking, we're not linking command verbs to specific marks, and there are no plans to go back to this approach. So I know in the current exam, with each of the command verbs that are used, there's sort of a certain number of sentences or a certain number of points that need to be made for each of those different words that are used. We are moving away from that in terms of the new edition of the qualification aligned to the 7th edition body of knowledge. And hopefully those examples that I went through earlier might also help to demonstrate that. So if it's a 20-mark question, whether it's describe, differentiate, explain, or interpret question, then each of those points that are given within that question will carry sort of 10 marks each. So you'll either be asked to explain 2 things or differentiate 2 things or interpret 2 things for a 20-mark question, and for a 30-mark question it will be 3 things. When it comes to state and outline, there are 5 marks each associated with those. So if you're asked to state in a 20-mark question, you'll be asked to state or outline 4 things, and for a 30-mark question you'll be asked to state or outline 6 things within the question. So that's sort of how the marking is looking at working. So what we need the candidates to do is to really understand those command verbs and what's required by each of those. So again, if it's a differentiate question, it's what the differences are, but also the reasons for those differences. If it's an explanation, it's an explanation of how something has happened, or the reason or the purpose for it. And if it's a description, then it's sort of focusing on all of the relevant characteristics and events that relate to that. So that's how the marking will be developed. So we are moving away from a certain number of sentences that are required for each of the command verbs. It's much more around those command verbs sort of carry the 10 marks, and state and outline carry the 5 marks each for each of the points that are there. And just to re-emphasise that, bringing up this example again, you have 2 explain questions on the screen. You've got an explain question that's worth 20 marks, and an explain question that's worth 30 marks. So in part A, you're asked to explain 2 steps in a configuration management process that help to manage the scope of a project. So we're looking at what those steps would be and how those steps help to manage the scope of a project. In part B, you're looking at explaining 3 steps of a requirements management process that help to establish the scope of the project. That would be looking for the candidates to identify 3 steps within a requirements management process and explain how those steps help to establish the scope of the project. And it's the explanation that carries those marks within there, as well as correctly identifying the steps. In terms of just some tips for candidates, so there's just sort of areas and elements that candidates should be aware of. That candidates should use a combination of the syllabus, indicative content and command verbs to guide them on how to answer a question. So the syllabus, the indicative content and the information around the command verbs is publicly or will be publicly available content. So candidates will have access to that as well. So just re-emphasising the point that Neil made earlier, the indicative content is there as an indication of the type of content we would expect in an answer. It's not a model answer, it's not all of the content we would expect, and that's primarily because it is a publicly available document. We don't want people just learning the content of the indicative content and sitting the exam. And there's a very key role for you to play as training providers in terms of providing that additional support and additional information to help candidates pass the qualification. The exam techniques document can be used as a guide on how much detail is required to write when answering a PMQ question, and also by reviewing how many minutes are allocated per question. So just because the question part is worth 20 or 30 marks, which people tend to view as that's a lot of marks to gain in a short time. If it's 20 marks, just focus on the fact you have to provide 2 reasons. If it's 30 marks, you'll be asking for 3 elements to that question, or 4 or 6 if it's state and outline. And remember that candidates have 6 minutes to answer part A and 9 minutes to answer part B. So for each element of the question, realistically, we're looking at 3 minutes for the candidate to be able to answer that. So just sort of bear that in mind when preparing candidates for writing those answers. When in the exam, candidates should think about time management and answer the required number of questions and ensure they don't run out of time. So again, just re-emphasising that point, if they don't answer the 10 questions in PMQ or the 6 questions in the PMQ for Prince 2, then those unanswered questions will score 0. So they do need to make sure that they think about time management and covering off everything that is required within the exam paper. And candidates should familiarise themselves with the sample paper and the indicative content, but remember that the indicative content does not include everything they need to know in order to pass the qualification. There are more tips in the FAQ section of the website and also in the exam technique document, but those are the areas we just really wanted to highlight within there. Okay, we've got a few questions coming through and we wanted to allow some time for those questions. I'm also happy to talk through those examples again in more detail should that be needed. So just bear with me while we go through some of the questions. We've had a question saying, does that mean that the study guide won't be published? The study guide will be published and it will be available in May next year. When the exams go live. So we are publishing a study guide as well as making the indicative content available. We wanted to make the indicative content available now in relation to the sample paper so people could get used to how the indicative content works in relation to the questions that we've issued as samples. The full indicative content will be published in January. So that leads on to the next question we have around will the indicative content be updated. It will be updated, so in January you will have the full indicative content. So for all those areas that aren't currently covered in the indicative content document, you will get information and further indicative content in January. But just to re-emphasise the point that Neil made earlier, there won't be any indicative content for any state or outline assessment criteria. So those assessment criteria that use state or outline, we won't be providing indicative content for those. Okay. So I've had another question come through, say how long in terms of sentences, words and paragraphs would be a typical 50-mark question required to be answered. Saying earlier, we're looking at, rather than having a number of sentences or a number of paragraphs or a number of points related to the command verbs, it's much more about how those command verbs are demonstrated in the answer to those questions. So for describe, differentiate, interpret and explain, that's 10 marks per point in the question. And for state and outline, that's 5 marks per point in the question. And it's about making sure that you can actually demonstrate what's required in that command verb. So either providing that explanation or the reasons for the differences or for the descriptions that are needed. Okay, how long would a typical outline state question be? So in terms of being able to answer those outline or state questions, they would have the same, we would recommend the same amount of time as any other question within the paper. So if it's part A, we're suggesting it's 6 minutes. If it's part B, we're suggesting the candidate spends 9 minutes answering those questions. Okay, we had a question, it doesn't specify which type of life cycle do we assume linear. I'm assuming that's referring to the sample question, question 10, in terms of that particular question. If there is not a specific life cycle written down in the question, then any life cycle is able to be provided in the answer. So it could be linear, it could be iterative, it could be hybrid, whichever the candidate would prefer to answer. Where it states a particular life cycle in the question, we would need the question to be answered in that way. Okay. So I had another question around about how we guide candidates about what to write. We'll be publishing guidance, previously high-level statements, depth and breadth, etc. So that's similar to the question we had earlier. We are not looking at producing those statements to say it'll be a number of sentences or a number of paragraphs, but it's about how the candidates actually respond to those command verbs and the points that are raised in the time that's available to them in the exam. So previously, I think where it's been an explain question, the explain questions have tended to be 50-mark questions, so you've had more to write in terms of response to that. We're now moving away from that, so we have 2 parts to each of the questions, part A and part B. Part A being 20 marks, part B being 30 marks, and it's about those candidates responding to those questions as they are written in the way that's required by the command verb in each of those questions. Okay, we've had a request to provide an example of an outline question. That's something that we can have a look at and take away. Okay, we've had a question come through, so are we thinking of extending the 3-month crossover? Currently it's May 2020 to July 2020. Are we thinking of extending that? No, the cut-off for the 6th edition body knowledge exams is July 2020, and that is remaining as it was before. The presentations will be made available to you either on MS Teams or on the website, or we can send them out to you. There's a question that's come through around resource scheduling and optimisation. Raymond, I think that's a question from you. Could you just send that question through again, please? Because I don't think it's come through properly on the list. So Raymond, if you're on the line, if you can resend your question on resource scheduling and optimisation, we'd be grateful. Okay, we've had a question relating to the online exam offering. Will this be invigilated online, or will they still need to attend the exam centre to undertake With the online exam offering, we'll be going into further detail on that in the webinars in the new year, but those exams can be remotely invigilated should you wish to take it in that way. Okay. So we've had a question set come in saying, can you please advise on what constitutes fair, good and excellent answers now that a defined number of sentences of guidance is no longer used? What we are planning on doing at some point next year, and further details will be available next year, is running some train the trainer sessions, which will allow you as training providers to come into a session and have a look at some anonymised scripts and see how they've been marked. So you can see how those marks have then been allocated to those scripts, which will hopefully provide you with some further information around the marking and the approach to marking within there. Okay. Sandra, there's a question that you sent through saying, can we use these techniques for the current 6th edition exam? If that's in relation to the command verbs and those responses, then the guidance that exists for the 6th edition exam should still be used for the 6th edition exam. The changes that we're making in terms of the split of the questions and the marking will apply to the 7th edition exams only. So if you're currently doing 6th edition exams, then you need to still work along the lines of the guidance and the information that's available for those 6th edition exams. If that doesn't answer your question, then please send through another question so we can clarify that. Okay, we've had a question through around the wording on question 10, saying why is it not say differentiate rather than explain how roles differ. That's something that we have previously picked up, and in the live questions we will be using the terminology differentiate rather than how roles differ. Okay, so we've had a question on the determine questions. So determine is not one of the command verbs in PMQ. It's describe, differentiate, explain and interpret. So there are no determine questions in the 7th edition body of knowledge question bank. So there will be no need to do any calculations in the 7th edition examination. The requirement will be to interpret data or interpret calculations that have been done on the exam paper already. It will not be about the candidates doing any calculations themselves. Okay. I've had a quick question through around resits. So if people are doing resits, they would still need to do that resit by the cut-off date of the old exam, which is in July 2020. Beyond that date, they would have to take the 7th edition examination. Another question coming on calculations, which we've just answered. Okay. So just to confirm again, because we've had a few more questions come through on that, there will be no calculations required in the 7th edition exam. Okay, so we've had a question around the anonymised scripts and comments being made available to all training providers, even if you can't make it to one of those events. The intention is that that information will only be available during those events because they are obviously individual scripts. They will be anonymised, but they are individual scripts. So the intention is they will be at those events only, but we will be looking at when we can run those to make them available to as many of you as possible. And we will be running them, sort of looking to run them more than once. Okay. Again, we've had a few more questions on calculations, so just to reiterate that again, there will be no need to do any calculations in the 7th edition examination. There will be the requirement to interpret the information that's there on the exam paper. Okay, so the sample papers are already available. We've had a couple of questions come through saying where are they, so we'll make sure when we send out this webinar and any sort of questions that follow, that you have the links to all of the documentation within there. Okay. Okay, so we've had a question around does differentiate always include the what and the why in A versus B, or just what is different from A and B. So if it's a differentiate question, then the answer we would require from the candidate would be what the differences are, but also the reasons for those differences. And that would refer to any differentiate question, whether it's 20 marks or 30 marks. It would be relating to the number of things that would be differing, but you would always need the reasons within there. Okay. Explain the difference between the outline and state verbs and what the expected answers will be. So if it's just a state question, we would just be expecting the candidates to state those responses without any sort of further real elaboration. We would expect a little bit more detail in terms of the outline answers that would be there. So looking at the outline, providing a little bit more context around those answers. Is there flexibility for dyslexic candidates, etc.? So all of the special dispensations we have in place at the moment will continue. So if there are any medical requirements or reasons for additional time to be awarded, then that's a question of contacting our service delivery department when booking the exams and providing the relevant evidence from there. That's not going to change, that process will still be the same. We have a question around saying how soon it will take to have exams marked. So the standard turnaround times would still be maintained with the 7th edition body of knowledge exams. So currently our guidance is up to 10 weeks in terms of the marking. Because I think currently we're operating somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks in terms of that turnaround time. But obviously when the new exams come in, we will be looking at putting in additional quality assurance measures because we have new questions that are in place, we have new exam papers, and against new criteria as well. So there will be additional quality assurance checks over and above the quality assurance checks that we're currently doing. So that time frame might extend closer to the 10 weeks rather than the 4 to 6 that we're currently operating on. But that's just so we can ensure that the additional quality assurance has been carried out to the level that we would expect. Okay. We've had a couple of questions around the dates for the trainer sessions. We are looking at when those sessions can be run, so we'll get those dates out to you as soon as possible in the new year. Okay. We've had a few more questions come through on state and outline, so rather than explain it in huge amounts of detail on the webinar, we'll look at putting some clarification together on that and circulating that as part of the frequently asked questions that come through so people can see the difference between those. Okay. Well, there'll definitely be at least one question for each learning outcome in each paper. That's PFQ and PMQ. So for PFQ, It will cover all of the assessment criteria in the paper, so there's 59 questions that will cover sort of one each from each of the assessment criteria, with one additional one within there. For PMQ, the specification that you have access to details that it will be drawn from a range of learning outcomes across the paper, so it's not that every learning outcome or every assessment criteria will be covered in PMQ, and that's the same as it is currently. Okay. The FAQs are on the website where you have access to the other information, so a question about where they can be found. So they are in the same place as all the other information that is available on the website. And I've had a question around saying, is APM creating a study guide as per the box 6? Yes, we are creating a study guide, and that will be available in May. Okay. Okay, Raymond, thank you for sending through your question regarding resource scheduling so that in the PFQ syllabus, the learning outcome around understanding resource scheduling, there's no reference to time scheduling, whereas in PMQ it's understand schedule and resource optimization. So the two qualifications are slightly different in terms of the learning outcomes and how that then sort of works. And PMQ is obviously building then on PFQ, but we'll give you a more detailed response to that question following the webinar. Okay. If there are any other questions that people want to ask, then please do send them through. We've had a few others that come through. Okay, sorry. So, will there be any drawing questions, critical path, for example? No, there won't be a requirement for the candidates to do any drawing, primarily because we're also offering the qualifications online as well. So it makes life difficult to do the drawing on the online exams, so there won't be any drawing required. Okay, and had a question saying, is the study guide an APM document? Yes, it is an APM document. Okay. Any other questions coming through? Matt, you recently just had a question through regarding balloons. If you can expand on that, then potentially we can answer that. I'm not entirely sure what you're asking, so if you could resend that question, that would be great. I had a question around, can we see the study guide earlier than May? At the moment, the study guide is being published in May, so that's when it will be available. Okay, we've had another question come through on the fact that APM only requires 10 of 16 questions to be answered. And does it not lead to sort of spotting certain sections and candidates possibly skipping certain sections? How do they prove overall competence? The basis of the PMQ exam is that it's based on a sampling of the syllabus rather than looking at all of the syllabus to be assessed. Obviously, the candidates don't know which areas of the syllabus are going to appear in the exam, and the exam papers change regularly. So they would need to know the coverage of the full syllabus to be able to perform well in the exam, and be able to answer those questions and score sufficient marks to pass on there. Okay. That's fine. Matt, thank you for sending through your question. I'll provide you a written response to that following the webinar, so you can see the work we've done in relation to relating the two things. Any other questions at all? Okay, I think that's all the questions that have come through. Hopefully you found that helpful and useful in being able to dive into some of the detail in some of those examples and talk through the sample paper and the indicative content. And we will make sure that we also provide a written response to the questions that have come through as well, and add those for frequently asked questions. If you have any further questions, then please send them through to the email address that's on your screen, and we can then respond to those before the next webinar, which will be taking place on the 13th of January. Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.